So we're quite excited to have Barry, and I'll have Barry do a little more introduction, through his slide presentation. But what's always great is when we have one of our own team members who was really taken or, found something of value in listening to Barry in a prior event or actually reading his book. And his book is called Connect, which I think says quite a bit. But, the person or the team member who referred Barry works in our investment office, and our investment office has been working on culture there for some time. And their new mantra, or their new statement, if you will, is one team, one fund. And I do think that what Barry will be talking to us about will resonate very directly, not only with the investment office, but frankly with the entire organization, as we have over the last 3 to 4 years been talking and prioritizing that it's a single team at CalPERS with a single customer group, and that's our 2 million members. And how do we work together more collaborative in a collaborative manner, so that we can accomplish those really positive outcomes that people are wishing that we can continue to do, whether we're working remotely, whether we're in the office. But that first and foremost, we're here to serve, and we're here to serve our members, but we're also here to work with our 3,000 public employer partners who also are struggling with this need to continue to connect in in this odd world that we find ourselves in today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barry. And again, about the 30-minute mark, please submit questions at any point in time. But at the 30-minute mark, we'll do a quick check-in, and we'll go to the live questions at that point. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barry. So welcome.
Thank you, Marcy. I really appreciate being here with everyone from CalPERS. Welcome to this presentation. We're going to talk about building teamwork and collaborating. And the presentation is based, as Marcy said, on a book I wrote about what I believe is the #1 ingredient for success. And there's many characteristics that are valuable for success, but I believe that one stands out, and that is getting along with others. Developing relationships is the #1 reason why businesses and organizations are successful. It's the #1 reason why people advance in their careers. It's a significant key to happiness. And I sort of added happiness to the title of my book. If I had to redo the title, I would add happiness to it, because since writing the book, I've learned that developing good relationships actually leads to happiness. So my promise to you is that by the end of this presentation, you will learn specific actions that for you to be successful, for CalPERS to be successful, and for you to be a happier person. So let's get going. I want to share with you the story about Google's quest to find the perfect team. And Google, as we all know, is an internet search engine. Hey, let's Google that. They're a technology company, and they're big on developing things like the driverless car. And they are an analytical company, and they pride themselves on being able to analyze anything. So, for example, when there's a cold or a flu outbreak, Google knows about 2 weeks in advance, because people Google looking for remedies. They're really good at correlating data and, that putting information together that looks like a bunch of puzzle pieces and then making sense out of it. And at any point in time, Google has hundreds of teams working on a variety of projects. They're a lot like CalPERS, so I imagine you have lots of teams working on a variety of issues. And Google noticed that some teams are working better than others, and they wondered why. And they started analyzing. And basically, they looked at all these characteristics to figure out what was most important. And I won't read them all, but they looked at, teams made of friends, and teams that had a big mix of young and old people. They looked at teams that were complete strangers. They looked at teams that had similar interests and random interests. And basically, they tried everything, but nothing worked. And they believed, ultimately, that there was no magic solution. So they were frustrated because Google couldn't figure out the solution from the data. So they decided to just watch the teams, do a qualitative analysis, and try to understand the behaviors that made these teams successful. And here's what Google learned. In the most successful teams, at the beginning of each meeting, team members spend a few minutes just catching up with each other. They ask questions like, how was your vacation and how was your weekend? Or they talked about milestones in their lives, like family, kids. They talked about local and regional sports teams and maybe a few rivalries. And they supported each other through tough events like sicknesses and deaths in the family. And all this engagement led to higher productivity for those specific teams. And Google concluded that the reason why is because people liked each other and they wanted to do a good job for each other. And that was the secret to creating great teams, people just getting to know each other. So several years ago, I was working in a community. It was in South Florida, and it seemed like everyone was fighting with each other. I wasn't living there. I just sort of parachuted in to help them on a problem. And in a frustrating moment, I asked the question, does anyone get along anywhere? And, like we all do from time to time, we Google things and collaboration, groups getting along. So I did my research, and 4 years later, I finished the book. And, it was one of those things where, somebody ought to write a book on that. Well, I guess, maybe I will. But it's now, it's available on Amazon. And I'll tell you this, if you are interested in writing a book, my contact information is at the end of the presentation. I can save you a lot of time by telling you all the war stories. So contact me and I'll tell you the pros and cons and so on and so forth of writing a book. You don't have to learn the same lessons that I did. So there's a picture of the book, and let's talk about some of the highlights of what I learned. So today, we want to talk about four things, sort of the four things that I learned in my research. And one is that there's barriers to communication in society. Basically, we're not always civil to each other. Second, I found some great solutions, which we'll talk about. Third, I found success stories, so you can see what other organizations and individuals have done. And then finally, some techniques that you can use immediately so that you can quickly collaborate. So this is not the end of the presentation, but I want you to know where we're going. And if you need to check an email or take a phone call or do something, step outside for a second, you can know where we're going. So here's the punchline. Number one is share personal stories. Adopt this philosophy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I want to hear stories about you. And they don't have to be in depth. They can be tidbits, but sharing personal stories helps us to get to know each other. Second is talk about equally. Talk about the same amount of time. If you can, try to talk a little less than half the time, but the research says about 46% of the time for the quants that really want to know. But bottom line is try to talk a little bit less than half the time. And third is assume positive intent. People have good intentions. People want the best for each other. No one's out to get us. No one's out to get me. No one's out to get you. Everyone's kind of like drifting through their own lives. So assume positive intent. So one of the things that we imagine, or one of the techniques that I want to talk about, we're not going to actually do an icebreaker, but icebreakers are techniques or exercises we can do at the beginning of a meeting that help us learn a little bit about each other. They can be generally kind of fun, but for the most part, they are small activities. We run through them, we talk about a little bit about ourselves, and people get a window into our lives. Now, I want to tell you that I may not look like it because I'm here making this presentation, but I'm a little bit of an introvert, and I don't really like icebreakers, or I should say I didn't like icebreakers until I began to research them and understand them and their impact on getting us to share a little bit about each other. And what I found basically is they practically almost always work in helping us get to know each other. So I've become an advocate of icebreakers. You don't have to do them at every meeting, but occasionally it's good to do something like like that to help us get to know each other. So bottom line is one of the messages I want to talk about, and I've provided a list of 30 icebreakers to CalPERS that folks can share, and they're good workplace icebreakers, very high level, not too in-depth about anybody's background. But for example, this is one icebreaker is, we're not going to do this right now, but let's go around the room of, maybe 15 people on our team, talk about our first paying job and maybe our most unusual job. And I've done this several times, and you get some very interesting answers, and it's just fascinating and a lot of fun. And then ultimately what happens is the next time you have a one-on-one with somebody, you ask about that unusual job. Tell me more about that job, and you have a little bit of a conversation about that. So one morning many years ago, my wife was traveling and I was alone in our apartment, and I got up and I got ready for work. I showered, ate breakfast, and I got in my car and I went to work. And as I headed out of the complex, I was getting onto the street and there was a lot of traffic, and I inched out into the line of cars, but the guy in front of me wouldn't let me merge in. So what did I do? I yelled, you dirty blah, blah. And then suddenly I realized I'd been up for 2 hours, and the first thing I said out loud was a very ugly phrase. And then I drove to work, and guess who was parking his car just a few stalls down? It was that guy that I yelled at. And he was doing the same thing I was doing. He was just trying to get to work. And I thought, maybe I need to give other people a break. Other people are not out to get us. They actually want you to succeed. So we need to assume positive intent. Everybody's just in their own world. So let's talk about some of the barriers to collaboration and teamwork. And the problem we're seeing today, and of course we're in this election season and there's a lot of friction, is that there tends to be a general lack of civility. People at times are just not nice to each other. And we've seen a decline of civility in the last decade. One, people are less civil. Two, they're more tribal, and we'll talk about this in a minute. They can be more offensive to each other, and we're more isolated, particularly in this virtual world, so that makes us a little more me-centric. The Guardian newspaper is a newspaper in London, and they did an analysis over 17 years of the comments that appeared in the newspaper online, below stories, and they were almost 100% ugly or nasty. So there's a general trend, and there's a decline in civility. 42% of workers say they've had political disagreements at work, and almost 3/4 of Americans say civility has declined since 2016. So all this strife leads to workplace stress. So why is this happening? Well, a big part of it is what I call the echo chamber of cable news and social media, and there's tremendous polarization in cable news and on social media. And we go and we find the news channel or the information channel that we like. How the news is covered is distorted by each side to reflect their viewers' interest. And then we have this thing called tribalism, where we tend to believe what our tribe tells us to believe. And tribes are religious groups, politicians, people we trust. And we listen to them and we say, yeah, I like that person, and therefore I believe what they say. And then there's the repetition of the message. And whether it's true or false, it's extremely effective. If we hear lies over and over, we tend to believe them. And it's very difficult to discern the truth, the half-truth, or lies. So be careful who you listen to and try to get a variety of perspectives. No matter what you're thinking, it's always good to flip the channels and see what they're covering and how they're covering. And let's talk about specifically advertising. Now, advertising is not about the truth. It's just about repetition. So take a look at these, try these out. The slogan, "You're in good hands." That's Allstate. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. That's Geico. You're doing great. And my favorite, love, it's what makes blank blank. It's what makes Subaru Subaru. Now, I'll tell you that I own a Subaru, and I like that car, but I don't love it. Now, some people love their cars, and some people have Subarus, and some people have other cars. So that's okay. You can love your car. But the bottom line is beware of the echo chamber. Beware of the messages that you're hearing, the repetition that you're hearing. That's where it's coming from. And then, of course, we have the pandemic, social isolation. We're losing our ability to interact with people. And social skills are like muscles. If we don't use them, we forget how to engage. So this has led to some people feeling more anxious, more impulsive, at times more awkward, and potentially more intolerant of others. So when we're back in person engaging with people, it may feel a little uncomfortable, and we may be that more me-centric. And then we have this virtual environment where there's no question, it's just not the same as being there in person. It's not bad, but it's not the same, and let's admit it. It's hard to connect virtually, and that's the bad news. But the good news is that when we do it, and it's obvious to me that when I'm on a Zoom call or a WebEx call, that it feels like the people I'm talking to are right there, even if they're looking at the camera, even though I know that they're not. But by seeing their faces, we catch emotions, we catch nonverbal communication, and it's easier to connect on a human-to-human basis. So as a result, when we see each other, we become more interested in each other and more motivated to do the work and hopefully develop a stronger feeling of connection. Again, it's not perfect, but to the extent that we can engage face-to-face, even though it's through a screen, it's better than just on the phone or nothing at all. So let's talk about the solution, which is share personal stories and how to get to know each other a little bit better. Now you might be asking the question, this is just little old me. What can I do? Well, focus on the people in your world, the people around you, and think about how you can influence what's going on and to make your world a better place. And then take action wherever you can. Be that person that takes action, that is just assertive enough to step out and develop that relationship. Let's talk about talking on a train. On a morning commuter train, people generally keep to themselves, and they read a book, a newspaper, they plug in, they listen to music or a podcast, and that's been my experience. Not maybe during the day when there could be more tourists or travelers, but definitely in the morning, commuters, everyone's keeping that to themselves. Well, researchers wanted to know if people would respond to a stranger sitting down next to them and starting up a conversation. If you were sitting on the train, would you ignore the stranger, or would they engage in conversation if that stranger started up a conversation? So think about it. You're sitting on a train, you're minding your own business, you're plugged in, and this total stranger sits down next to you and says, I really like your tie or your scarf, or, where'd you get it? Or I see you're reading something about sports, hey, what do you think of the 49ers or the Giants' chances of winning next year? Are they going to beat the Dodgers, So researchers, they asked the people who were going to get on the train, how successful will you be at starting up a conversation? Will people actually engage in a conversation with you? Will they be open to a conversation? And because we're not together and I can't hear you all, I'll just give you the answer. 50%. 50% of the people who were getting on the train said half the people would not talk to them. Well, the results were different. 100%. All of the people that they sat down next to started up a conversation. They participated. And some of the conversations were not as long as others, but they took place. And by the way, they have repeated this research in a variety of venues, like train stations, buses, doctors' offices, just a variety of public places. And the bottom line is that there's a gap in our heads about approaching people to talk. People want to chat. So it's okay to start up a conversation. If you're standing in line at a store, hanging out at a party, it's okay to start up a conversation. People want to talk, and that's how you connect with people. Now, I do need to say that use your discretion. Sometimes people can get the wrong impression if it's a complete stranger, like maybe you're trying to hit on them. So use your emotional intelligence, evaluate the situation, and keep the conversation light. But the bottom line is, it's okay to start up a conversation. And one of the big lessons that I learned in my research was that only you can change your mind. So let's look at how some others have done it, and we can look at the success stories of the people and groups around us, what other organizations have done, and then that helps us to learn the lessons from other people. So I want to tell you the story about Oakton Community College, or OCC, and their success in keeping students in school. So, at first, let me just say that it's really difficult to quantify the value of relationships. I mean, put a number on relationships, financial value or an effectiveness value. Obviously it's done through behavioral science. There's behavior, action, and then results. And this case study actually does a good job of quantifying what happens when people actually take the time to get to know each other better. Now, persistence is a measure that colleges use to determine the percent of students that continue from semester to semester. And generally, from fall to spring, the persistence is 62%. That is, 62% of students return from fall to spring. That seems a little low to me, but that's the number. And colleges and universities talk about this number all the time. And at Oakton Community College in Chicago, they wanted to increase that. So they created the Persistence Project. And persistence is good because everyone wins. Students stay in school, improving their job and career opportunities. Society benefits because there's more educated people in society, a more educated workforce. Colleges receive more money in tuition and fees. The college staff stays employed, so there's more job security. And more graduates and alumni mean that there's more school ambassadors in the community to support the school and send more students to the school. So here's what Oakton Community College did. Here's the process. In the first 3 weeks of the semester, the teachers learn the name of the students. And if you've gone to college, you realize teachers learn the name of students, that's a new one, but that's what they did. They learned the name of their students. They scheduled one-on-one conferences with each student. In those conferences, they discussed the standards of the class, and they recognized they needed to allow some flexibility for homework, test taking, recognizing that students at a community college may have other responsibilities in life. And then the teacher gave frequent assignments, small assignments and small tests to provide feedback. They wanted interaction between the student and the teacher. And these are things that they talked about in the one-to-one conference, is what was their first reaction to the school and what are your career ideas, which is a great question because people love talking about the things that they want to do. They talked about interests and hobbies, and they talked about some specifics like, were you able to get all your books? Okay. And, do you have any concerns with the course requirements? So they got into the nitty-gritty of some of the issues. But basically the goal was to get to know each other. And they had very positive results. And as I said before, the normal persistence was 62%. But after the project, or the project is still going on, they were able to increase persistence from 62 to 78%, which is a 26% increase. And plus, everyone learned how to connect with each other and develop a positive, trusting relationship. So they consider the project to be a great success and have continued. So now let's talk about some of the specific actions that you can take to improve your relationships. We're all with the goal of improving effectiveness of the organization. So another icebreaker, as an example, if we were here in person, we might do this, but this is a fun one, is you go around saying, what were you doing 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and 30 years ago? And recently I did this in a group that had a variety of ages in it. And some people were in the same exact job 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years ago. Some people went from their current job all the way to grammar school, which was a lot of fun. And some people weren't even born. So it was really a fun icebreaker, a lot of laughter, and we all learned a little bit about each other's history. So into the successful methods. I wrote Connect because of this guy, Thomas B. Tart. He's a friend of mine, and here's Tommy dressed as Abraham Lincoln because he's a big history buff, and he goes around to schools and gives presentations and reenactments as the historical characters themselves. And Tommy's one of those people who walks into a room and everyone is his friend. He's not trying to gain any advantage. He just loves people, and he has that ability to get to know them quickly wherever he goes. And you probably know some people like that, or maybe you are that kind of person, but they're not everyday people. They're more few and far between. So I asked Tommy once, how do you do it? How is it that you get to know people so fast? And his answer baffled me. He said, what are you talking about? And I said, Tommy, you walk into a room and immediately become friendly with everybody. And he still had no idea what I was talking about. So I said, I'm just gonna have to watch you. And I did, and here's what I found. Tommy asks these kinds of questions. He says, where are you from? What's it like? Tell me about it. And when did you move here and why? Where'd you go to school? What activities do you like? Do you have any hobbies? And not long ago, I tried out Tommy's method when I was working with a new colleague, and he was kind of a buttoned-up lawyer who was difficult to get to know. Nothing against attorneys. They're my best friends. But when we had a break in the meeting, I thought, well, let me try this. I asked my new colleague, Matt, I asked him if he had any hobbies. And he kind of blew me away. He said, fire dancer. Okay, so one of my hobbies is playing hockey, and my skill level used to be up here, but now it's like way down here. And I thought that was kind of an unusual hobby, but I never heard of fire dancer. So I asked Matt, to tell me more about fire dancing, like when he did it and why and how he learned it. And he was just nonstop jabber, jabber, jabber. And now when we get together, we talk about his fire dancing, his last routine, and I talk a little bit about hockey, and then we get into the work, and it flows a lot better. So here's some other successful techniques that you can use. At work, you can talk about what are you working on now? And interestingly, what challenges are you facing? And this is a particularly good one because everyone has challenges. It's good to be specific, and sometimes people have a little advice, and sometimes people just like go, oh wow, that's a drag. But it's good to talk about those kind of things. And here's a good one that is great to ask if you're talking to somebody outside of work, if you're not sure if they're retired. So you might say, one question that's easy to ask is, what do you do? Well, if somebody's retired, that's a little bit of an odd question. Well, I used to do this. But you can ask the question, what's got your attention these days? Now that works for somebody who's working, for somebody who's not working. And recently I asked somebody that at a get-together, a very small get-together outdoors, and they talked about their grandchildren and what they were doing, babysitting for their grandchildren. We had a great conversation as a result. And I don't think I would have asked that question if I hadn't learned it before. So what's got your attention these days is a great way to start a conversation. So here's some other conversation sparkers and icebreakers. You can ask people what they're streaming these days. This is a favorite of mine because I stream shows and I want to learn what people think is good. I listen to podcasts. Have you listened to any interesting podcasts recently? uh, talking about music, what kind of music people like. You can ask a specific question. What was the best part of your weekend? Anything good in your world happened recently? It's kind of a fun thing. It's a good positive question to ask. When we took vacations, you can ask, where people went on their last vacation. You can ask people about their shelter at home experience and how that's going as well. And everybody's got a story. So there's some ideas. Remember just to be like Google. At the beginning of a meeting, take a few minutes, catch up with each other. You can ask for ideas or advice, the podcasts and the streaming. And as a leader, it builds trust and it shows vulnerability and it models good behavior. So if you're a leader or a manager in your group, doing these kind of activities and stepping out shows, and being an example shows that this is important to you. And recently I had to go somewhere. I was traveling by car. I had to go to Utah. And I asked my staff, I'm the CEO of the California Municipal Utilities Association. I asked my staff, what they thought about the traveling. And frankly, I wasn't sure that they had anything to tell me that I didn't already know. But it was something that was going on in my life. And I thought, well, let me ask the question anyway. And boy, I was really glad that I asked, because they gave me some great travel tips. Several of them have traveled throughout California, visited some family. And, I got some great advice, and it helped, build that relationship a bit further. And on our staff, just like you all, people are having issues with children in schooling, and pets with issues, and family who are battling issues. And this is a good way to help each other and support each other and get a little closer together. So sharing personal stories works to build great teams. And there's one other valuable lesson that I want to mention, and that is when we share personal stories, it helps overcome the unconscious bias that we all carry. And the more we get to know each other, the more we respect each other. We all come from various backgrounds. Sharing and learning just a little bit about each other builds bridges and allows us to understand when we have differences of opinion or differences of approaches. Now, I have a confession to make. I'm not a great listener. And during the shelter home era, apparently my wife thought that I wasn't listening to her very well. And one day she said to me at lunch, I ate 4 cockroaches in the garden today. And fortunately, I was listening. And I said, how did they taste, honey? Because 4 cockroaches is a lot. Now, I found a better way to listen, and that is to be curious. So when someone's talking, you can say things like, that help you get engaged. You can say things like, interesting. Wow, tell me more. Basically ask follow-up questions. All those active statements help keep your mind, my mind, on your conversation partner. And they help you talk less than half the time, that sweet spot 46% of the time. So be curious about what someone else is taking. But also remember, this is not a competitive conversation. Don't try to one-up the last story. You don't want to say, well, that's interesting, but let me tell you my better story. Keep the conversation focused on the other person and listen reflectively. So how do you do that? You ask follow-up questions. You mentioned you volunteer at the animal shelter. For how long? Tell me about it. What kind of experiences have you had? Or you have an interesting name. Where are you from? And names are key. It's everyone's favorite word. Your name is your favorite word. So don't be afraid to ask about a name. It's actually a compliment to get someone's name right and to say it right. And it helps you learn a little bit about each other. Of course, there's always a few naysayers that are reluctant to try something new, and they might say something like, well, we don't need this touchy-feely stuff. I know my colleagues well enough. Well, remember, relationships are the number one reason why people advance in their careers. They're the reason why deals get done. Relationships are the number one leadership attribute for advancing in your career. and they are the key to happiness. Now, we need to be sensitive to cultural issues because people have different customs, and ours may not be the same as theirs. And some cultures don't value sharing personal information. And some cultures are, for example, are not trained to look at their superiors or their elders while talking. So in those cases, focus the discussion on work topics. Talk about current projects, lessons learned on a project, recent experience. If an employee doesn't want to engage maybe in a large group, then the supervisor can reach out separately and privately to have a one-on-one with that employee, try to coach them into sharing, or if they don't want to share, at least they can have that conversation with the supervisor and get some comfort over time. Now, this is a political era. Things are charged. Should we talk politics? I'll tell you two perspectives. One, absolutely. If they agree with you, you'll have a very nice conversation. But if they don't agree, be prepared to have and to hear an opposing position, and be prepared to engage with them by asking, why do you like your candidate or that particular policy? And just try to understand them more. You will not be able to convince them. You can't convince them, but you can learn a little bit about their perspective. Now, alternatively, no way. Don't talk politics, because if they disagree, that you can make an enemy where you might have had a productive relationship. So the bottom line is you have to be sort of emotionally intelligent about it. Be careful about talking politics. I tend to lean away from talking politics. Clearly, as a supervisor myself, I try to lean away from it because you never know who you might be offending. But nevertheless, if you're going to engage one-on-one, be careful about talking about it. So how do we disagree in a productive way? Is that possible? Well, I have three general rules for doing that. And number one is don't try to change someone's mind, as I just said. Instead, try to learn about them. Ask about their opinion. Why do you support or oppose this issue? Or why do you, if you're talking about, a work issue, why do you say that? What's your rationale for that? And then ask permission. Can I share my opinion with you? And hopefully they'll say yes. If they say no, it's the end of the conversation. But if they say yes, their mind is open to hearing a little bit about your opinion, if nothing else. The second is you can call a truce. If things aren't going well, you can just say, you know what? It looks like we don't see eye to eye on this. You like the Giants, I like the Dodgers. Let's just move on. And the third is try to agree on something. Obviously we're both passionate about baseball. So let's just leave it there and move on and talk about something else. So if you can't agree on something, you can at least agree on, you've got a great rivalry going, isn't that fun? So I found that there's a magical phrase that helps to open people's minds that can diffuse a tense situation. And the phrase is, consider this. And it basically says, I'm brainstorming. What do you think about this idea? And sometimes I go a step further and say, this is a crazy idea. Let's have some fun with this idea. Or I'm just brainstorming here, but use that phrase, consider this, and it begins to open people's mind. So let's talk about attitude. Zig Ziglar said, it's your attitude, not your aptitude or your knowledge, that determines your altitude. And what he means is it's not what you know that leads to success, but having a positive attitude. And I agree with him. And here's why. It's that people like being around other people with a positive attitude. And there's this concept of emotional contagion, which is a well-studied field of psychology that is we are influenced by the people around us. It's called the Chameleon Effect. And if you walk into a room and people are happy and jovial, you feel better. If you walk into a room and things are tense, you can feel the tension. So if you come to work with a good attitude or a bad attitude, it'll rub off on others. Either one will. So that impact of being a Doug or Debbie Downer, has a negative impact on collaboration and productivity, and it's a strong impact, and it goes both ways. So, a positive impact has a positive attitude has a positive impact on productivity, and a negative attitude has a negative impact. So, if you're around somebody who has that negative impact, try to distance yourself and try to shift the subject away. But more important, be a positive force yourself. Remember, focus on your orbit. You can be a positive force in the world around you. It will rub off on other people. Lee Iacocca, the former CEO of Chrysler, said, business, after all, is nothing more than a bunch of human relationships. It's not just what we do, our organization's mission, it's the people in the organization that make it better. So, to conclude, we're almost done. Remember, share personal stories. I'm going to tell you about me, and I want to hear about you. Talk about the same amount of time, or maybe a little bit less than half the time, and assume positive intent. People are not out to get you. They want you to succeed. So assume positive intent. And I mentioned happiness. So what's that connection to happiness? And we're coming in for a landing here. Now, at the end of their lives, no one wishes that they spent more time at the office. Harvard has done a study of adult development. It's the longest study of human development in the world. And they followed hundreds of people over 80 years. And from the time they were teenagers, in 1939 is when they started the project, to today. And in their first class, they had John F. Kennedy was in that class, Ben Bradley, the future publisher of the Washington Post. And then they compared them to people in the Boston area who were from troubled families. And they asked them one question. If you had a problem, do you have someone you can call in the middle of the night? And this question, it turned out, in all the questions they asked in the survey, turned out to be the measure of, do you have a good personal relationship? And what they found was, regardless of income, that once your basic financial needs were met, you had shelter, you had food, your bills were paid, good relationships correlated strongly with happiness. And they found that happiness leads to good health, and not the other way around. It wasn't that good health leads to happiness, it was happiness leads to good health. So in the study, relationships were a better predictor of happiness, and even better than having a high IQ, having a lot of money, or even being famous. Smart people are not happier. Rich people are not happier. Famous people are not happier. The head of the project said the key to healthy aging is relationships, relationships, relationships. Obviously, you've heard me say that many times today. But the bottom line is that connecting leads to happiness, and it doesn't matter with who. Family, friends, colleagues, your community, even strangers. Just keep connecting. So one last very quick story, and then Marcy, will be back to you. So years ago, my daughter was in junior high school, and we went to the supermarket to shop, and as we were going through the checkout, the cashier said, "Finding everything okay?" And I said, "Yep." And she said, "Sure is nice weather we're having." And I said, "Yep." And she said, "Well, how about them Knowles?" And that was the local college team, the Florida State Seminoles. And I said, "Well, they're doing good." And we got about 3 feet beyond the checkout counter. We're pushing the cart out to the car. My daughter said to me, "You know, Dad, you weren't very friendly to that woman." And I said, I wasn't not nice. I was neutral. I wasn't positive or negative. And she said, "Well, I don't know what it seemed like to you, but to me, it seemed like you weren't very nice." Well, we started to walk to the car, and in silence, and I put the groceries in the back of the car, and I got in the driver's seat, and she was sitting there in the passenger seat, and I turned to her and I said, "Emily, you're right. I can see how my neutrality could be perceived as being negative. I'm going to try to do better." And that's what I've tried to do in my life, is try to give the gift of a pleasant conversation. I look at it as a superpower. I have it, you have it, and you can choose to use it. And you can make someone's day. You can make someone feel good about themselves when you do it. You'll feel good yourself And trust me, you'll feel happier and they will feel happier. So use your superpower, give the gift of a pleasant conversation. So as I said, this is my contact information. I'd love to collaborate with you, and I'd be happy to talk with some smaller groups at CalPERS if you want. Just happy to do that or do some exercises. This is my contact information. I promised if you also are writing a book or interested, I'd be happy to talk with you about that too. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Barry. And I really do appreciate the offer to help some of our work teams. So we did have a question here that, she said, my first paying job was a reservation agent with an Israeli airline. I don't speak Hebrew and had to be ready to answer all questions from people trying to make reservations. This is before computers existed. But her question is, in sharing a story about yourself or myself, is a little like getting people into my personal life. Does that really de facto help build trust?
The answer is yes, ultimately, because I get to learn a little bit about you. If you're interested in a story about me, that's okay. That may not be, but by learning a little bit about you, I mean, in hearing that story, I would love to hear more about that, because I think you probably have some funny stories about communication and maybe some snafus and maybe some successes and how you worked out the language. And those kind of experiences are fascinating, and we learn lessons about each other. So it helps me know a little bit about where your heart is and how you think. So knowing that when we have to turn to a work-related issue, we know each other a little bit better, and that helps us to work on our work project better.
Thank you. And then the other question that came in was, as you're getting to know your teammates, do you believe that has a significant improvement on productivity as well, like employee engagement?
The answer is yes. I highlighted this a little bit in the presentation, but ultimately, when we get to know our colleagues, we like them. And when we have a project that we both have to work on, and this happens a lot, where we have to coordinate on something together. We have to go back and forth. And somebody has to say, well, I'll do this. And another person will say, well, I'll do this. If you don't like that person, you're not going to volunteer as readily. You'll wait for the assignment. If the supervisor wants to give me the assignment, fine. But if you're collaborating with somebody, you'll say, you know what, I'm good at this. Let me go get this. Can you do that? And there's a much greater chance that there'll be a collaborative atmosphere between two people when they know each other and like each other.
And then the last one I got was, with, everyone being essentially socially distanced, 6 feet apart, wearing a mask, it's very difficult to connect. Many of our team meetings, people don't turn their cameras on. Do you think that this is going to have a long-lasting impact on people's ability to work together, or do you see this being short-term?
I see it as short-term. Well, first of all, if you're going to do an icebreaker at the beginning of a meeting, everybody's got to have their cameras on, and they've got to be looking at the camera as opposed to keeping their cameras off and just chatting. That's a requirement. But the icebreakers will do that. I'm praying that this is, temporary and we get back to work, as soon as we can. I see it going on for at least another 6 months and maybe a year. So that's why we need this patchwork or these Band-Aids to help us get to know each other a little bit better. But bottom line is, I think it's temporary. There's no question. I think it's temporary, and it's going to be an interesting thing when we look back at it and go like, remember that time? We took some action to try to get to know each other a little bit better. We had to be more assertive about it, and it taught us some lessons about how to engage with each other a little bit more. So I'm hopeful that we can expose some of those relationship issues that we have to try a little harder at. So we need to focus on doing that, try harder, and then hopefully we'll forget all about it. Actually, you know what, Marcy? I'm pretty sure that elements of Zoom, and this will be the last thing I say, elements of Zoom are going to remain in our work lives for a long time. That we may have some flexibility with people working out of the office. So it's probably going to be a hybrid, and making sure that we get to know those people that are on Zoom working remotely is going to be key. So being assertive about getting to know each other is going to be important.
Yeah, I think we've found that many of our teams are doing, daily huddles. The executive team does a daily huddle. We do turn our cameras on. I am encouraging people to turn their cameras on. I think we've have, some people who are kind of shy about doing that. I've gotten a few questions about whether it's mandatory. We've not made it mandatory. We just want people to be able to fully participate in the meetings. But you did talk a little bit about this me culture, and do you really think that we're going to be able to overcome that long term by using some of these techniques that you explained about, being positive about the future? We say that all the time. We're going to be positive about the future, but, very steeped in reality that we have big problems to solve as a society, as an organization, as a team, as an individual, whichever lens you want to look through. But this me culture, if you're asking these open-ended questions, you as a leader, your primary responsibility is communication and setting the right culture within your team, getting to know your team personally as well as professionally. Do you think that there's hope for society, for cultures, for organizations long term by using some of these techniques to make sure that we're not always thinking about ourselves, but we continue to think of others? And in the public service, we tend to do that more often. We came into public service because we have this attitude where we want to serve others. But what do you see generally happening?
I'm hopeful. So, yeah, I'm definitely hopeful. It's a never-ending marathon, and the only thing that we can control are the things in our world. So it's kind of up to each of us to take that initiative. If we want our orbit, our world to be a better place, if we want that hope, and if we want positive engagement in our world, we have to take that initiative. It doesn't mean that we have to be, the ringleader at a circus all the time and saying, Yahoo, things are great. Nevertheless, by, looking for the positive, by asking questions about other people, you will be that person that inspires the conversation and keeps things going. And by being consistent about that, then it'll make your world a better place. And I think that's all we can think about. Who among us is going to, run for big political office? That's not really the thing we're talking about here. We're talking about making our initial or our orbits, our world, a better place. And each one of us can do that just by initiating some of these conversations and having those positive conversations.
Right. Well, Barry, we're almost out of time. I just really wanted to thank you for joining, us here at CalPERS. I know you're a CalPERS member yourself, which is wonderful. So just so we are here to serve you as well as you're thinking about, whatever options you have as you get closer to, hanging up your public service hat and maybe being, a full-time author, although it sounds like you have some lessons that may not be conducive to a second book, but you never know. You made it through it the first time, correct? But just want to thank you again. These are really important opportunities for our team. Connection is certainly something that we have been, focused on here about how do we continue, this CalPERS family feel that's in this organization. That's the number one thing I hear when I talk to people, is that we want to make sure that we preserve this family, type of atmosphere, meaning everyone's working together. They're having fun at work. They have a really important mission. And they feel good about coming into work. And so we have about half of our organization that wants to return to work. And then we have another half of the organization who says, I'm quite productive remotely, and I'd like to continue in that fashion. So we're going through all of those decisions, and we'll be giving, more definitive direction to our team here shortly. But again, just really wanted to thank you. Anything that we can do just to increase people's perspective, give them new tools and techniques to be more successful, we certainly want to do that. And in particular, having it come from a team member referral, that that net promoter is really important. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Marcy. And Dan, you've got a great team in the preparation of all this, and good luck with all that. And shout out to Irena. Thank you again, And I love CalPERS. I've had several good customer service experiences, so keep up the great work.
All right, wonderful. That's great to hear. Bye-bye. Have a good day.